Hello, and welcome to Starbound. My name is I Am Duck, and I'll be your narrator. If you enjoy human-created HFY stories and want to support us, we're on Patreon now. You'll also get access to exclusive stories you won't hear anywhere else. Link is in the description. Now let's get into it. The warning was written in Svizra script. Commander Vermark recognized the source and set it aside. The Svizra were cautious to the point of paralysis. Everyone knew that. They filed reports on things that did not need reporting. They had been doing it since before the Nazi had reached the outer systems, and nothing they had ever warned about had come to anything. Whatever they had found alarming about this pod, it was almost certainly nothing. He gave the order to proceed. The pod had come off a derelict human vessel found drifting in unclaimed space 3 days out from the Nazi border. The vessel itself was long dead. Hull breach in the aft section, drive systems cold, no transponder, no response to hailing on any frequency. A ghost ship, by any reasonable measure. It had been drifting long enough that the hull had accumulated the patina of abandoned things. Dust, micro-impact scoring, the slow oxidation that space allowed. The salvage team had cut through the hull on the port side and worked from there in the dark. It was the kind of silence that accumulated, rather than simply existing. The silence of a place where machinery had stopped a long time ago, and nothing had moved since. The emergency lighting had failed at some point in the vessel's history. Vermark's helmet lamps threw narrow cones of illumination through the dark that caught dust and little else. The corridor walls were human construction, functional, utilitarian, riveted at the joints in a way that suggested the vessel had been built to work rather than to be aesthetic. Whatever had killed it had not been enough to take the structure down. Humans built robustly. The first Svizra marker was on the compartment door at the end of the corridor. Vermark's lamp found it at 20 meters, the mauve catching the light in a way the grey metal around it did not. He stopped, glanced at it. The Svizra had been here before him, then. They often were. Continued. The corridor ran another 30 meters to the sealed compartment door. They had found the pod in a sealed compartment on the vessel's lower deck. The pod itself was standard human configuration, roughly 4 meters in length, slightly less in width. The design functional and without ornamentation, the way most human equipment was. It had the look of something built to do a job rather than to be looked at. There were markings stenciled along the upper surface, human script, alphanumerical, the kind of identification codes that military equipment carried. Vermark could not read them. The translation systems aboard his vessel handled spoken language adequately, written language poorly, and human stenciling not at all. Whatever the markings said, they said it only to humans. The cryo systems were still active. The indicator lights along the upper panel glowed a steady amber, which meant the occupant was in suspension and the pod's power cell had not yet failed. The transfer had taken the better part of an hour, cutting the pod free of its mountings, rigging it for transport, while cutting a second hole in the hull nearest to the pod's compartment, and bringing it straight across to the salvage vessel, without damaging the cryo systems. Vermark had supervised personally. A cryopod was not salvage. It was evidence of something, and evidence required handling. Whatever was in the pod intact was more valuable than open. Now it sat in the Nazi vessel's salvage bay under the full bank of working lights. The second Svizra warning marker was on the control panel, not on the hull, not on the side where it might be noted and passed over, on the control panel, on the exact surface where hands had to go to operate the seal. Whoever had placed it had known exactly what they were doing. Druck Venn picked it up. He turned it once in his hands. Mauve, the universal danger color, and Svizra's script around the outer edge. He looked at Vermark. Vermark had served 12 years on the border systems. In that time, he encountered Svizra documentation on 17 separate occasions. Sealed containers, derelict vessels, recovered material of various kinds. In every case, the warning had described something that turned out to be either inert, already resolved, or simply unfamiliar to a species that treated unfamiliarity as a category of hazard. Not one of those 17 warnings had been wrong, exactly. Not one had been necessary. He looked at the marker in Drakven's hand. Mauve. Svizra. He had seen this before. 17 times. He had seen this before. He nodded. 17 encounters with Svizra documentation. Not one of them had required anything more than this. Drakven set it on the equipment shelf to the left of the pod. It sat there. Proceed, Vermark said. Drakven's hands moved to the control panel with the ease of a man who had opened a great many sealed containers in his career and expected this one to be like the others. The Not C had encountered human cryotechnology before, at a diplomatic distance. They had data on the seal mechanisms, the revival protocols, the pressure systems. It was not unfamiliar work. The cryo seal broke. From somewhere inside the pod, a calm, human voice began speaking in a language none of them could understand. It was unhurried. It said what it had to say, repeated twice more, and stopped. Equalizing pressure hissed out. Cold vapor rolled across the bay floor in a low, white cloud. The amber indicator lights along the upper panel shifted, and then, in the same instant, the transmission indicator on Vermark's wrist display tripped from amber to red. His hand went to his wrist display. Standard jamming protocols were active. They had been active since they boarded the derelict. Standard procedure for any recovery operation in unclaimed space. A transmission required time to initiate, time to encrypt, time to broadcast. He had the display up. He had his fingers on the override. The red light was already steady. Transmission, came the comms officer's voice through the internal channel, level as trained voices were. Encrypted burst. It has already completed. Duration? 0.3 seconds, Commander. It fired on seal break. Automatic. Vermark looked at the indicator on his wrist. Our jamming equipment was active. Yes, Commander. It caught nothing. The signal operated outside our parameters. Frequency band we don't use, don't monitor. We would not have known to block it. A beat. We cannot determine the destination. Vermark was not a man given to dwelling on errors, but he was exacting about identifying them. The error here was not the jamming failure. Jamming equipment could only block what it had been designed to block, and no one had thought to design it for a frequency band no one used. The error was the assumption that opening the pod was an action with a defined set of consequences, all of which could be managed afterward. He had proceeded on that assumption. The transmission had already left the ship before he'd finished forming the thought that he should stop it. One consequence. Unmanaged. Before anything else had happened, he did not know how long it would take, if it had summoned anything, or what would come. He stood with that for a moment, the red light steady on his wrist. The cold vapor continued to drift across the floor. Inside the pod, the revival sequence had begun. He could hear it in the subtle change in the machinery's pitch, the system shifting from suspension maintenance to active revival. Whatever was in the pod was coming back. Vermark looked at the mauve disc sitting on the equipment shelf, letting his eyes slide unfocused over the Svizra script. Filed as a problem for later, he told himself. He watched the pod. Cryo revival was not clean or fast. Vermark had seen the process documented. Human physiological data was available through the diplomatic exchanges. Dry, technical summaries of what the body went through when it came back from suspension. The documents had described it in the detached language of medical cataloging. Core temperature restoration, circulatory restart, neurological reactivation and sequence, a system returning to operational status by known steps. What was happening in the pod was not clinical. The occupant's first breath was a rough, tearing thing that filled the salvage bay. Not a gasp, something deeper than a gasp, something that went all the way down as though the body were reminding itself what breathing was. Then movement, fingers first slow and deliberate, and then the shoulders, rolling forward with the heavy deliberateness of something very large coming back to life. The cold vapor was still drifting. The amber lights had gone steady again. The occupant opened his eyes. He lay still for a moment, long enough that Vermark registered it, long enough that he could see the eyes moving, left, right, up, taking the ceiling in, then the lights, then the walls of the bay. Not panicked, not confused. The eyes moved the way an instrument moved when it was being pointed at something. Methodical, deliberate, gathering data. One hand had dropped to his side, fingers searching briefly until they found what they were looking for. His expression did not change. Then he slowly sat up, with the careful economy of a man who was running a systems check on himself. He sat on the edge of the pod and did not look at the not-see crew for a moment. He looked at his hands, turned them over once. Then he looked up. He was large by human standards. Vermark had the diplomatic data to make the comparison. Broad through the shoulders, densely built, the kind of frame that read as physical weight, even at rest. Dark hair, close-cropped, a face that had, by the look of it, encountered significant violence at various points and had not been excessive, marked by the experience. He looked at Vermark, at the crew, at the bay around him. He did not stand, he did not raise his hands. He sat on the edge of the pod with his hands resting on his knees, visible, and he waited. Vermark watched him. He was watching for the things he always watched for in a recovering situation. The shift in posture that meant aggression, the sudden movement, the display of size or teeth or whatever the species used to signal threat. It was involuntary, that watching. 12 years of border work had made it reflexive. He catalogued threat signals the way Druck Ven catalogued recovered material. Automatically and continuously. The human gave him nothing. He was simply present, large, still, hands visible, giving nothing away. By every framework Vermark possessed, this was cooperative behavior. An entity that was not threatening, an entity that appeared to understand it was outnumbered and was behaving accordingly. The translator unit chimed. It had been running since the seal broke, cycling through the human language index against the pod's automated announcement, finding its footing. The chime indicated it had matched the language in the announcement. Vermark activated it. He had spoken to humans twice before, both times through diplomatic intermediaries. He had no established protocol for this. He used the one he had: identify the vessel, establish non-threat, request identification. It was what he would have wanted in the same situation. "You are aboard a not-sea salvage and recovery vessel," he said. "You are not in danger. Identify yourself." The human looked at him for a moment, then, "Main, or Blair, SAS?" A pause, the voice, unhurried, roughened by Cryo and unbothered by it. "Human, soldier, UNDF." He said nothing further. He did not ask where he was. He did not ask how long he had been under. He did not ask about the crew or the ship or the circumstances. He answered the question he had been asked and stopped. Vermark waited for more. It did not come. "You will remain where you are," Vermark said. "You will not attempt to move through the vessel." The human, Main, looked at him with an expression that was not quite agreement and not quite anything else. "Understood," he said, which was not the same as yes. Vermark noted that. He had dealt with cooperative individuals before. They said yes. They meant it or they did not, but they said it. This one had given him something more careful than yes, and less useful. Main looked at him. "I need to use the head," he said. Vermark waited, looking blank. The translator offered nothing useful. "Sanitary facilities," Main said. Vermark gestured to one of the crew. Main was escorted out. The bay was a different room without him in it. Not quieter, something else. When he returned, 2 cases had been extracted from the pod's interior and placed on the bay floor beside it. Druck Ven moved to them. There were 2 of them, standard human transit configuration, hard-sided. Vermark watched Druck Ven crouch beside the first case and work the latches. Main watched, too. He did not move, he did not speak. He watched Druck Ven's hands on the latches with the same attention he had used on everything else since he woke. Still, continuous, missing nothing. Vermont caught it from the corner of his eye and filed it without yet knowing what to do with it. The first case opened. Drakven was quiet for a moment, looking at the contents. Then he began to catalogue, aloud for the recorders, in the flat professional voice he used for all recovered material. Blocks of pale material, waxy in appearance, uniform sizing, wrapped in sealed outer membrane. Quantity, he counted, efficiently. 8 blocks, cylindrical metal components, small diameter, varied length. He lifted one carefully, examined the tip, set it down. Function unclear. Coiled wire, insulated. Handheld device, grip configuration, single control surface. He looked at the blocks again. He picked one up, turned it over, squeezed it slightly with his thumb. It gave a little, the way dense, soft material gave. Plastic or polymer compound, he said. Possibly an adhesive, high density. Right, you. I put that down, Maine said from across the bay. The voice was quiet, not loud, not sharp, quiet. The way a door closing quietly was still a door closing. Drakven stopped. He looked over at Maine. Expression unchanged. Drakven looked at Vermark. Vermark looked at Maine. The human had not moved. He was not displaying anything, no aggression, no urgency, no visible tension. He had said those words in the same tone he might have used to note that it was cold in the bay. Continue, Vermark said. Drakven set the block down and moved to the next item. He watched where each item was placed. Maine's expression did not change. Vermark watched him watching and felt for the first time something it could not immediately name. Not threat. The human had displayed nothing that triggered threat assessment. Something quieter than that. A wrongness in the geometry of the room that he could not point to. He set it aside. Drakven had reached the second case. It did not open. The second case had a seal Drakven did not recognize. Not a mechanical lock. He had worked those in every configuration the recovered material of a dozen species could produce. Not an electronic seal, not a combination system, not a key slot. The surface of the case where the latch mechanism should have been was smooth and faintly recessed, with a small contact pad at the center that was warm to the touch in a way the rest of the case was not. Drakven pressed it. Nothing happened. He pressed it with 2 fingers, with his palm, with the back of his hand. He examined the edges of the case for a secondary mechanism. He found nothing at first glance. He looked at the contact pad again. There was a marking beside it, small, standardized. He ran it through the identification index. Biometric, human configuration. He looked across the bay at Maine. Maine was already looking at him. Drakven stood and turned to Vermark. I cannot open it without either the registered user's compliance or forced entry. A pause. Forced entry will damage the contents. The seal is designed for that. Vermark looked at the case, then at Maine. Open it, he said. No. The word arrived without heat, without apology, without anything attached to it. Maine said it the way he had said everything else, as a complete statement. Vermark let a moment pass. That was not a request. Maine looked at him. Something moved in the human's expression, not quite amusement, not quite anything with a name. I know, he said. The silence that followed was not the silence of the derelict. That had been the silence of absence. This was something else, the silence of a room in which everyone was waiting to find out what kind of room it was. Vermark had been in rooms like this before. He had always been the one who knew the answer. In this room, he did not. Drakven had gone still beside the case. The 2 crew members near the bay entrance had gone still as well. The way that people went still when a conversation changed registers, and they were waiting to find out which register it had settled into. Vermark considered his options. He had numbers. 4 personnel in the bay, armed against 1 human. He had the ship. He had, by any material accounting, every advantage in the room. He ran it through methodically, the way he ran everything through. Force was available, restraint was available, the human was won. On paper, this was not a difficult situation. He had resolved more difficult situations before breakfast on the border systems. The paper version and the room he was standing in did not match. He also had a case he could not open without either the human's cooperation or the destruction of whatever was inside it. and whatever was inside it, a sealed intelligence package traveling with a UNDF operative in a cryopod on a vessel that had been running dark in unclaimed space. That was not something that became more valuable when it was forced open. That was something that became worthless. Mayne knew that. The certainty of it was in the way he was standing, hands on his hips, not going anywhere. He was not trying to escape. He was not negotiating. He was simply present in the way that a locked door was simply present, not aggressive, not cooperative, entirely immovable. He was using their ship as a waiting room. The thought arrived fully formed and sat there. Vermark turned it over, found no flaw in it, and wished he had. Vermark felt the wrongness again, sharper now. He had said 2 words, and somehow the geometry of the room had shifted in a way that Vermark could not account for through any framework he possessed. "Watch him," he said to Drak Ven, and left the bay. His briefing room off the bridge was 2 levels up. He took the ladderway rather than wait for the lift. He needed the walk, a terminal, enough quiet to think. He sat down, turned on the display, and navigated to the SFZRA network index. He accessed the salvage bay files and opened the image of the marker. The marker, the one Drak Ven had set on the shelf, had a reference code along its inner edge. Standard SFZRA documentation practice. Every physical marker referenced a filed report, accessible through the galactic network to any registered vessel. Vermark had not looked at the reference code at the time. He looked at it now, in the image, and entered it into the search field. The report came back in 4 seconds. The SFZRA maintained their network infrastructure the way they maintained everything else, like a fine chronometer. It was meticulous, as was all SFZRA documentation. The filing date was 18 months prior. The reporting vessel was a SFZRA mercantile craft operating in a Sector 3 systems, from where Vermark had found the derelict. The summary header read, "Encounter with human cryogenic pod, Class 4 advisory, mandatory network distribution." He read it. He did not read quickly. The SFZRA wrote the way they did everything, carefully, completely, without omission. They had found the pod, they had noted the warning marker they themselves had placed on a previous occasion, a different pod, a different vessel, a different sector, the same advisory. They had, unlike Vermark, read that advisory before proceeding. They had contacted human diplomatic channels and waited. The human recovery team had arrived in 11 hours. What the report described in the careful neutral language of SFZRA technical documentation was what the intervening 11 hours had looked like. Not because anything had happened. The SFZRA were at pains to make that clear. Their crew was unharmed. Their vessel was undamaged. The pod remained sealed throughout. They included this information in the introduction of the report and again at the close. What came between was an account of 11 hours aboard a vessel with an unopened human cryogenic pod, a warning mark on its control panel, and a recovery team inbound on an unknown timeline. The report documented what the crew had done during that time. It was equally clear about what they had not done. The markers existed because a previous crew on another vessel in a different sector had not waited. The report was sparse on what had followed. It did not need to be detailed. He read that section twice, not because it was unclear. The SFZRA were never unclear, but because he kept arriving at the end of it and finding that he had been thinking about his own salvage bay while he read, mapping what the report described into the room he had left 20 minutes ago, checking the fit. It fit well, better than he would have liked. Do not open without human authorized personnel present. Do not handle the contents of associated cases. Do not attempt to confine the occupant. Request human diplomatic contact immediately and wait for the response. And then, in the careful, quiet, entirely serious voice that SFZRA documentation always used when it most needed to be heard, "We do not say this because we were harmed. We say this because we were not, and we would like the same for you." Vermark sat with that for a moment. Not a long moment. The kind that was just long enough to know that the shape of the next several hours had already been decided. Then he thought about the case in the salvage bay that he could not open, the transmission that had already gone out, the human standing across the bay, waiting. He stood up and went back to the bay. He left the display powered on. The salvage bay had changed. Vermock stood in the doorway and took it in. Maine was standing. He had moved from the edge of the pod to a position roughly in the center of the bay, hands on his hips, weight evenly distributed. He was simply standing in the middle of the room in the way that a large object simply occupied the middle of a room. The crew was on the far side of the bay, not against the wall. Not pressed back, not visibly alarmed, simply redistributed, in the way that people redistributed themselves when the geometry of a space shifted, and standing where they had been standing no longer felt like the right place to stand. Druck Ven was near the equipment shelf. The two crew members were near the bay entrance, which was to say, near Vermock, which was to say, as far from Maine as the room allowed. None of them had moved because Maine had told them to. Vermock was certain of it. There had been no order, no gesture, no threat. Something in the room had simply shifted while he was gone, and this was where everyone had ended up. Maine looked at him. "Commander," he said, "I think we should talk about your options." Vermock walked into the bay. He did not hurry. He stopped at a distance that felt, by the calculus of the room, approximately correct, and he looked at the human standing in the center of it. Maine waited. "The transmission," Vermock said. "Already sent, automatically when you broke the seal." Maine's voice was the same as it had been since he awoke. Level, unhurried, roughened slightly by Cryo and unbothered by that. "Recovery team is coming. I won't tell you when, truthfully. I don't know myself. I will not tell you if I did." "And the cases?" Maine glanced at the first case, still open at the bay floor where Druck Ven had left it, the contents catalogued and neatly arranged, then at the second case, sealed, beside it. "The first case," he said, "contains materials I know how to work with, and your crew does not. That's not a threat. It's a fact about enclosed metal spaces." A pause. "The second case won't open for anyone on this ship, not even me." Vermock did know that. He had suspected it since Druck Ven's report. He had been sensing it, the way that someone sensed an unpleasant thing that had not yet finished arriving, since he sat in his briefing room and he read Svizra's report. "You are one man," Vermock said, "on my ship with my crew." "Yes." Maine looked at him steadily. "And a recovery team is coming. The demolitions are in this room, and the second case cannot be opened. Those are the facts of this situation." Another pause, shorter. "I'm not telling you what to do with them. I'm telling you what they are." The bay was quiet. Vermock was aware of his crew at the edges of the room, aware of them the way he had been aware of things today that he had not expected to need to be aware of. The first case, open on the floor, the mauve disc on the equipment shelf, the human standing in the center of the bay, not performing anything, simply present the way that a fact was present. "The warning," he said. "If it came from your people, why was it on the pod?" Maine looked at him. The expression shifted. Not quite a smile, something drier than that. Something that had seen enough of the world to find it occasionally worth acknowledging. "It wasn't from us," he said. "It was from the Svizra. They found one of ours before you did. They're thorough that way." Vermock said nothing. The human was right, and they both knew it. He had been right since before the seal broke, possibly since before the pod was found. He thought about 17 warnings. Not one of them was wrong, not one of them necessary. He stood there for a moment with that. This one had been both. Vermock spent the 4 hours it took the recovery team to arrive in his briefing room. He churned through the backlog of paperwork that had plagued all captains since there have been captains. He filed the preliminary incident log. He drafted the opening of the report 3 times and deleted it twice. The third version he left on the display, cursor blinking, and went to check on the bay. Maine had spent the 4 hours in the salvage bay. He had not attempted to access the ship's systems. He had not moved the contents of the first case. He had sat on the edge of the pod again, stood, or paced the edges of the bay in the contained, deliberate way he did everything. And he had not done anything that Vermock could point to as a threat. The crew had remained on the far side of the bay. Nobody had suggested they move back. Vermock had looked in once, an hour into the wait. Maine had been standing at the far end of the bay, hands clasped behind his back, studying the bulkhead with the focused patience of a man who had waited in worse places than this and knew how to use the time. Vermock had stood in the doorway for a moment, observing, then gone back to his report. A single UNDF vessel, mid-size, running weapons cold. A deliberate signal, Vermock understood, that this was a recovery and not a confrontation. They had made contact on standard diplomatic frequencies 20 minutes out, identified themselves, requested docking clearance with a courtesy that meant the request was not quite optional. Vermock had granted it. The 4 UNDF personnel who came through the docking collar were compact, professional, carrying themselves with the economy of people who had done this before and expected it to be straightforward. They spoke briefly with Maine. Whatever passed between them was quiet and took less than a minute. Vermock did not catch the words. He was not certain the translator would have helped. They collected the cases. They were courteous to Vermock in the impersonal way of people who were being courteous because it was the correct thing to be, not because the situation required warmth. Before he left, Maine paused at the hatch. He did not look back immediately. He stood there for a moment, and Vermock had the distinct impression of a man concluding an internal accounting. Then he turned back. The mauve disc was still on the equipment shelf where Druck Ven had set it. Maine crossed to the shelf, picked it up, and looked at it for a moment, not long, the way a man looked at something he already knew rather than something he was reading. He turned it over once, in his hand, then he put it in his pocket and walked through the hatch.